on the internet, I believe. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Subvisual Live Talks after a small hiatus. Don't forget to send your questions to hashtag Subvisual Talks on Twitter or ask them on chat. And without further ado, let's go to Corey. Hi, Corey.
Hi. Hello. Hello
Hey.
from the middle of the day.
So Corey, first of all, for anyone that's here listening that doesn't know you, can you start with a quick intro of who you are and what you do, and we'll go into more detail afterwards.
Sure. I'm a software developer by career. I've branched out in past years to founding companies and doing trainings, but overall, I'm just another software developer out there. I was heavily involved in one of the lead people in Code Retreat, and sort of created the whole global day of Code Retreat type of thing. Yeah, and just not a ton extravagant to say as much as that.
That's fine. Then I'll dive right into the first question that I always ask, which
Uh-huh.
is, how did you get started in tech? Like, what was the first thing that brought you into this world? Was it as an early kid, or was you a late bloomer?
It was very early. I was one of the sort of like lucky privileged kids that had a computer in the late 70s, early 80s. So my father had moved over to be a programmer in the late 70s, and I was born in 1973. So it was right about the time as I was, turning 6, 7, 8 years old, and there was a computer in the house. And I was incredibly lucky to have it, especially because we grew up more on the poorer side of the economy, sort of lower middle class. I'm not going to say, but we sort of on that border. So I was very lucky to have that. And it was right at the time when personal home computers were starting. They were really expensive, but they were starting to be available. Radio Shack was selling things, and a lot of the advertising was switching over to be, this is boys thing. And so I was lucky enough to get roped into that, got magazines. I was thinking about it, and I thought, maybe it was kind of easy to get into it then, but it's kind of easy to get into it now if you want. Like, there's a lot of resources back then, but back then everything that I worked in was written in BASIC.
Right.
And so you would buy little books that had long listings that you'd have to type in, and they were games and things. And then I was playing a lot, and I realized that if I got stuck in a game, I could hit break and look at the code to see what I was supposed to do. And then over time, I started to realize that I could just bypass. There was these great commands where you could break, and then you could just resume at a specific line number. And so I would just resume a few lines past where I was at. And then over time, you learn that you can change it. And then what really got me into tech, though, was when I was about 12, I started getting into bulletin board systems. And so calling BBSs, leaving messages, talking to friends. And I had there was one BBS that I called into that was a role-playing game. And my friend and I, my friend who ran it, we were interested in building little games for it. And there was another person that I knew on the BBS systems that so this was probably 12 or 13, and he sort of guided me along, told me get a copy of the K&R, the Kernighan and Ritchie C book. Turbo C by Borland was just coming out, the IDE. It was the beautiful days when you you know, you kind of bop the language. That was, yeah, 13, 14, I started learning C. And then I very clearly remember when I was 15 and Turbo C++ was coming out. It was the 1.0 version of their IDE. And it was the first IDE that had a multi-document interface, so MDI, so you could have more than one window open at a time. And all I wanted for Christmas was Turbo C++ 1.0, because I was super nerdy, as you can tell. And came down for Christmas, and there was Turbo C++ 1.0. And this was probably 88, 87, 88, somewhere around there. And there was no web.
Right.
There was no, you went to the books, you had books, and I didn't really have access to like Usenet or anything. And so I learned C++ from the manuals, the Borland manuals. And my friend and I started learning how to program, and we programmed. I built like a calendaring system that you could put in, and then every time your computer booted up, it would see if you left a note for the day, and if you had it, it would display it. And so I started learning all of that. And it was interesting because I seemed to, in my early career, not even my early career, but early pre-career, I seemed to always probably built 2, 3, or 4 different databases, not realizing they were databases, because like the first one for this calendaring, I needed to have a file. It was a flat file storage system. And so I built a thing that knew, you know, you had the messages and the offsets and everything in one file. Well, I had to build another file that told me what the offset and what the bytes were, where I had to search in each file. So effectively, I had built an index file for this other thing. And a thing that was this huge impression on me when I was that age was that I had built this thing and it worked really well, but I couldn't figure out how to delete. Like, I just couldn't figure out how to delete messages. And I went, my mother's friend worked at Microsoft at the time, and this was when Microsoft was still like 3 buildings. And I grew up in Seattle, right. So I was near that. And so I took a bus, probably 2 hours travel to get to Microsoft, where my mother's friend worked. And he showed me around. They had free ice cream bars, like free nut bars, which was amazing. And I was talking to him, and he was a programmer, and I was explaining what I had built. And I told him, I just can't figure out how to delete. How does it work when you delete a message? And he goes, oh, well, what you do is you can mark it as deleted. And then when you exit the program, rebuild your index, like rebuild your file. And I remember my mind being blown by the idea that someone else had thought about the same problems I had thought about. Right. Because I didn't really have, my friends were learning to program too, and I didn't know. My father was a Fortran COBOL programmer, and I was learning C++ and all of that. And so it just blew my mind that these problems have been solved. And it was a really pivotal time for me. And then I just kept doing it as a hobby. And I went to school for maths. So I wanted to be a maths professor.
Why not computer science at the time? Was there no courses still, or?
Didn't know that it was something I could study. Like, I didn't think about it. I wanted to be a physicist. Since I was like 11, the first time when Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking came out, I read it, and I was like 11 years old, and it turned me on to, I wanted to be a theoretical cosmologist before I even knew what that meant.
Right.
And then I went to college. I dropped out of school halfway through my second year of high school and switched over to a community college here in the States, and um, I was taking physics classes, and I realized that I had to do labs if I wanted to get a physics degree, and I hated labs because they just never work. But at the same time, I was taking math. So I was taking my math courses, calculus, and going through trig, going into calculus. And I saw there was this beauty that I had. So I just switched over to be doing that. Computers were always a hobby of mine, not like a goal or a career type of thing. They were always that super fun, creative thing that I did, and less about the thought of doing it full time or as a thing. But what happened was, the way that I got into it as a career, so that's sort of the long story of my youth. Right. But I had always been programming, and I spent my last year of university in Hungary, and then stayed there for another 3 years teaching English. And my last year, I was a horrible English teacher. And I didn't like doing it, and I was not good at it at all. And so I finally stopped doing it, and I found a job in the job ads to work as a salesperson at an internet company. And then that morphed into working as a web developer at one of the first web studios in Hungary. And that sort of, not, being tired of teaching English and hating it, sort of, I was like, well, I know how to program.
Right.
So there was a job possibility. So I went, and that was 97.
What technologies were they using back then? Do you remember?
Yes. So while I was teaching English, I wrote a program. I got a contract writing a program for a language school to manage their courses, everything. And that was in VBA.
Okay.
So Visual Basic for applications inside Excel. I loved Excel. I didn't know VBA, and the only thing I had was the Excel help files. And they were all in Hungarian, which I spoke, but it was still like, imagine learning the language just from the help files. Right. It was a horrible program. This was another case where I ended up building a relational database inside Excel using worksheets as tables. Makes sense. And it ended up supporting like cascading deletes and like referential integrity and all of those things that I built.
Yeah, I'm sure there's still people doing that today. So.
Oh yeah, and I remember somebody asked me why I didn't use Access, and I was so out of touch with everything that I was like, oh well, I wanted to use a Microsoft product. And so I didn't have like a lot of community around me, and plus I was in Hungary where there just wasn't a big community, and so the web stuff. I started programming web, and it was pre-ASP. We ran on Microsoft servers, but it was pre-ASP. So it was like IDX files, ITC, I forget what the extensions were, but basically you wrote a file that contained sort of the queries that you wanted to do. And then there was another file that was vaguely HTML-ish that could use it. So it was this really weird.
Was that a specific language for that, or was it on Visual Basic still?
Oh no, this was not Visual Basic yet.
Oh, okay.
This was a pre all of that.
Okay.
Visual Basic was around, but it wasn't being used. We didn't have a script or anything. And then, so this was in 96, the end of 95.
Okay.
And then 96, the beginning of 96 is when ASP 1.0 came out. And the breath of fresh air going from these really, I remember having a hard time with these files, this in IDX, and I don't know what they're, somebody will remember them. But then ASP came out, and it was 1.0. It was very it was very simplistic, but it was a scripting language where you could write VB script, and you uh, merged it. It was like PHP.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was, and so that was just, I did that for a long time. So that's what we built everything in at this web studio. And then I got a copy of Visual Basic 4 or Visual Basic 3, one of the two, and started doing more Visual Basic. And then, and then I just kind of I worked at the web studio for a year, found an offshore programming job.
Mm-hmm.
That was an offshore team based in Hungary for a company that was in Cleveland, Ohio.
Okay.
And then that was all in Visual Basic. So I did that, and then
I was going to ask. So when did you then you moved back to the States at some point?
Yeah, the '97 I moved back to the States and and started doing. That was really when everything kicked off. And I started.
And you kept doing work with Microsoft products and technologies for a long time. Like when did that change for you?
Yeah, so I worked in Visual Basic from '96 through 2001, and all the way from VB4 to VB6, and loved it. I still love Visual Basic. I think it was. I'm really happy that I sort of learned OO through Visual Basic and not through something like Java, because Java was out as well by then. Or
why do you say that? That's kind of
so. There's one wonderful thing from the OO perspective that VB had, or VB doesn't have, and that's implementation inheritance. So Visual Basic only had interface inheritance. So if you needed to do a form of you couldn't design using inheritance. You could only design using delegation and composition.
Okay.
And because of that, subclassing was never part of my tool set. And I always would have a interface and then completely separated out from the implementation classes. So it was much easier to make sort of reusable designs and extensible designs, because you would just implement the interface and then you can delegate down to other things. And over the years, I think, at least in the group I hang out with, there's been that push of delegation over inheritance and composition over inheritance. And I attribute to Visual Basic my early learnings that that's the way to go. And eventually people looped around. And then 2001 was when .NET came out. And I was working at a company in Cleveland, Ohio. It's Progressive Insurance. And the project I was on, we didn't really have a lot of work at the time. And so we downloaded the betas for .NET. We got Terrarium was just coming out, the first versions of Terrarium, which was you would build little animals and they would wander around and do stuff. And so my friends and I learned C# and then shifted over to C# entirely. I didn't like, I'm blanking on what it was, but there was something about VB.net that I fundamentally disagreed with. Like there was a checkbox you could click that would let you do something in VBNet, and it might have been. I don't think it was variance. I think it was not. Maybe it was not having to declare a variable or something. I don't know. But I so fundamentally disagreed, and I was like, I'm doing C#, going for that. And I loved C#. It was a really good. I loved working on the CLR. I ended up building a lot of stuff in C# and building a lot of like a lot of systems that were very, very extensible. So like I built, when I was at Progressive Insurance, I built a testing tool that ended up not really being a testing tool, but an automation framework. And it ended up being a little bit like Nant or Ant, sort of like a way to script things or to put out steps. But it was totally extensible, and there was extensions for running and checking web. There was extensions for running and checking .NET Forms. We had made an extension to test database stuff. We actually had built an extension to automate this like IR robot that we had. And so it was just this beautiful system. And I love building really highly extensible systems in Sharp.
At some point there, so I think I started way later than that, but I also I got to know of you first from the Ruby community. So did you get into Ruby through Rails, through the web, or like was that after C Sharp? Was there anything in between?
It was directly after C Sharp, and the way I got into Ruby was actually through the Agile community.
Oh.
Because in 2004, I had gone to I was working at Progressive, and they brought in some companies to do Agile immersions for our teams because everybody was starting to do, doing Agile experiments in 2004. And I got really involved in it, loved, really went wild for TDD, evolutionary design, all of these concepts, and started going to the conferences, started going to the Agile conference every year. And when I first started going, everybody had Windows machines. And then over the course of a couple years, everybody switched over to Macs. I was the last holdout on a Windows machine. And Ruby started happening. And so you started seeing this. So for example, I think it was 2005 when there were a lot of talks. It was at the very beginning of BDD. And so the early thoughts around switching from test to it and should and a lot of that, and switching from asserts to shoulds and talking about more the language that we used around testing. Because it was a design methodology, TDD was a design methodology, not a testing methodology as much. By now everybody, people have read all about the early days, I hope, of BDD, where it was less of a full-blown methodology and more of just like, let's fiddle with the wording. And so right around that time, I started seeing Ruby popping up more and more at the conferences. So at first it was Java and C Sharp, and then you started seeing Ruby. And I became good friends with David Chelimsky, who of RSpec, and he and I would see him every year at the conference, and we would pair, and he'd be working in Ruby. And so I started over a few years, probably like from 2005, 2006 to 2007-ish, started getting a little bit more and more. And then I got tired of C Sharp.
Right.
And wanted to do Ruby. I was like, ooh, I really like Ruby. The thing that happened was, as I had started doing TDD more, I was working in C Sharp, and I tended to do what later became more of a called kind of like London style TDD, where you'd use a lot of test doubles. And the problem was that I would say like, oh, I know this, I know that I'm going to have this function. I'm just going to use the name. I'll get to it. But C# doesn't let you do that. It would put the little red squiggle, and I would have to go add it to my interface and define it everywhere and all my tests, all of this stuff, when I knew that I was going to get to it, but I'm going to get there. Don't hassle me. And then I started doing Ruby, and Ruby fit nicely into this view of like what I originally would call turtles all the way down, which was just mocking all the way down. And then I watched the SICP videos, the MIT videos for structure and interpretation of computer programs. And they talked exactly about this concept, and they called it programming by wishful thinking.
Right.
Where you just, I hope there's a function like that. And so I switched to calling it that because, well, I'm not going to make up a term for something that exists. And so Ruby fit so nicely in that mentality and that way of thinking of, I'm going to push off the worry and the thought about this function. I'm just going to assume that I have something that does what I need it to do, and I'll get there. And so Ruby really turned me on, and C# I started moving away from. And then I decided I wanted to get a Rails job. This was 2006. So Rails was just coming out. People were starting to get excited about it. And so I decided in 2007 that I'm going to get a Rails job. And so I just learned Ruby and Rails. And then 2008 is when I got my first Rails job, the beginning of 2008, and left the C# and the Microsoft kind of world. I still had a lot of friends in the Microsoft world, but sort of left doing that on a day-to-day basis. And then that's when I started doing Ruby.
A couple of things that you mentioned. So one, very, very quickly, is about conferences. So obviously, like you mentioned, you started attending conferences. You also at some point started speaking at conferences. So how was that journey for you? Is something that you still enjoy today? And secondly, how do you view the conference world right now with the whole pandemic that's going around, and not being able to actually go to conferences, and the conferences still being held, some of them remotely? How do you think that affects the experience of a conference?
2008 was kind of when I started speaking at conferences, and I was really excited about Rails. And so I actually did some talks at Microsoft. They were called, I believe they were called Day of .NETs. And they were these regional city, like small, couple hundred people. And the summer of 2008, there was a whole slew of these through the area that I was in, that I lived in, around Cleveland. And I went to all of them. I was good friends. We would all hang out, a group of us. And I started doing more talks on Rails and things like that. And then for me, what ended up happening was 2008, you started getting the backlash from how the Agile community had switched the majority of the focus, especially at conferences, over to process and management type things, and leaving a lot of the tech stuff behind and not talking as much about it. So 2008 saw the rise of the software craftsmanship movement. And I was sort of in that group and in that community. And so I started talking about software craftsmanship and talking about practice and talking about technical techniques and practice and all of that stuff, and spent a few years doing a lot of software craftsmanship talks. And that's about when Code Retreat started. Code Retreat started in 2009. I did my pair programming tour in 2009, which was just going around pairing with people in exchange for room and board. And so I spent the year doing that, not working, just driving around in my little car. So that was the conference scene was really great because it brought community together around certain specific topics. For me, it allowed me to have the opportunity to put the thoughts I was having into a coherent see the world. Mm-hmm. I got to travel around, and that was really great. And I was very passionate about both the technical practices around really the extreme programming technical practices and deliberate practice and a lot of the early software craftsmanship ideas. And I was very passionate about it, and I love to talk about things. Mm-hmm. And so it's really a great opportunity to go out and do that. Career-wise, it always helps because more people know about you. I was slowly transitioning into I spent a couple years doing code retreats as training inside companies. Mm. And so giving talks raised awareness of me, and so it helped drive business to me. I found for myself that I started being less passionate about the topics I was talking about. So around 2013, and I was finding that I would go give a talk, and while I agreed and liked and believed in what I was saying, I wasn't excited about it.
Right.
And I kind of looked around, and there were a lot of other people who were excited about it, sort of second generation, third generation in the craftsmanship movement. And so I just stopped. I was like, I'm not going to talk anymore about these things. There's other people who are giving better talks. You don't need to hear me say the same things over and over again. It's not, it felt for me like I was starting to just do this because it gave me a trip somewhere.
Right.
And also I started wanting to just be home. I didn't enjoy traveling every couple weeks. And so I stopped giving talks, and I still went to conferences, and I occasionally would give a talk, but I decided that my talks were for the next couple of years were always going to be live coded. Mm-hmm. There's going to be no me standing up there with a bunch of slides. It's going to be me, Vim, terminal, and I'm just going to code stuff.
Do you feel more pressure there, or it's just like for the adrenaline rush, or?
Well, for me, it was more that I wanted to show things. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to share what I was learning more than just stand and talk about concepts. Not to say that those are not good talks. Those are really great, important talks, but I didn't find myself that interested in doing them or excited about doing them, or even that I had anything new to say. I kind of had already said what I wanted to say. But if you stand up on stage with your editor, you can say here, let me show you something. And so I started doing some more off the wall kind of talks. I learned a little bit of Prolog. And so I gave a talk with a basic introduction to Prolog. Mm-hmm. And it was all just Vim. I built a little Prolog application. I started playing around with building things up with lambdas. And so I started giving talks where I would sit there and build a numbering system entirely with lambdas, or build some basic data structures. And so it became more of I like to believe I'm an entertaining speaker. And if I can stand up there and give a talk that is something somebody hasn't really seen before, then that's a talk I want to give. Mm-hmm.
At some point, getting a little bit into the books that you wrote and are writing, you at some point wrote a book called Understanding the Four Rules of Simple Design, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so where obviously the four rules of simple design were already coined at that time, you decided to write a book of understanding them. I'm guessing from your experiences in Code Retreat, maybe, and seeing how people misunderstand them. Uh, is that correct?
Yeah. And well, when I would do code retreats, over pretty quickly within the first, I think, couple of years, I started focusing in on the code retreat lessons and the learnings from code retreat being really all about simple design. And we would focus, when I would facilitate them, I would focus pretty much entirely on applying the four rules of simple design to your minute by minute work. Because when you think about the different concepts we use when we design systems, we have you have design patterns, for example, which everybody, like, I was introduced to them in the late 90s and went, like most people do, and went nuts with them and started using them all over and like designing my systems with them. But over time, you understand that design patterns are a communication mechanism, not a design mechanism. So as you build your system, you start to recognize that there are these patterns that have bubbled out in them. And so you might see that, like, oh, here's something that is basically a template method. And so you can start talking about it with people, but it's not a way to create the design. Then you come down to like the solid principles, which are what a lot of people stop at when they talk about designing. They go, I understand the solid principles, I use them when I'm programming, but the problem with the solid principles is that they don't guide you minute to minute. They don't guide you when you're writing every line of code.
Mm-hmm.
They don't guide you in small refactorings. The refactoring step of TDD, the solid principles don't discuss that. They don't influence that. You don't make changes based on single responsibility. So the solid principles end up being a slightly lower level than design patterns. They're really important to keep in mind, but they are also a description of your system. And when you are making larger architectural changes or a larger design changes, keeping the solid principles in mind are important and very valuable. But minute by minute, when you are coding, when you're sitting there in front of your editor and you're writing some tests and you're writing some code, the things that can influence what decisions you make are the four rules of simple design. You have to have your test passing. No duplication. Like, when you are moving to the refactor stage of TDD, part of the goal is to remove duplication. That's it. There's no goal of single responsibility or Liskov substitution when you're making that TDD refactoring step. But there is removing duplication. Understanding that duplication is about knowledge, not about code. So coming back to like the dry principle being about one canonical source of truth for information. And then names. So like duplication and names. If you are doing a TDD process and all you worry about is aggressively eliminating duplication and naming things well, that will evolve your design towards a design that satisfies the solid principles. And that then leads to design patterns.
Right.
You'll start seeing these design patterns come, just sort of blossom into place. Mm-hmm. But the four rules are what you use and you should keep in your mind, really it's the two rules, because your test passing should be a given. And the two rules of no duplication and naming, and you just keep iterating on those. So Code Retreat was about spending the day practicing your minute by minute steps. What do you do minute by minute as you're coding? And the 4 rules are naturally that. So we would focus on them. And so I got to the point where I knew like the Code Retreat was a training workshop. And so I had all of that down. When I stopped doing Code Retreat and stopped facilitating them in 2013, 2014, I took basically all that I had talked about and all that I would do during the day, and I just wrote it in a book.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
And that's where that came in. So the book is like very small examples of applying the 4 rules of simple design to your code while you're building it. So it's very, very pedantic. Very much, what if we go overboard on applying these things, like names of tests, things like that.
And if anyone's interested in reading the book, I've just posted on chat on Twitch, and I'll have it. If you're seeing YouTube, it'll be on the notes, on the description of this video, a coupon code to get it. So Corey, I have another question though on the. You kind of mentioned the minute by minute thing in terms of these simple rules, and I was wondering if you think it also applies at the higher level. Particularly, I have a question in regards to what you see nowadays a lot, which is a separate backend from front end, and then do you apply those rules to each separately? Or do you look at the whole system and then you say like, okay, I don't want repetition, and this is something I personally have some trouble accepting sometimes, is like the duplication of state management or the duplication of routing and stuff that you have holistically in your system just duplicated. Do you think that still applies?
It always applies. The question though is whether or not it actually is duplicate.
Right.
So, if you think about duplication of knowledge, routing is a really interesting thing, because routing on the back end is routing a HTTP request to a function. Routing on the front end is generally routing a behavior that you want your front end to do to a function, which is an API call. And so you can argue that isn't actually duplication. There is the knowledge of what the actual URL is, but the way I often will look at it is that the front end really lives in the domain of the user. The back end lives more in the domain of the application management, state management, or not necessarily state management, but your data, like that. And so, especially if you're doing a pretty resource-oriented kind of model where you're doing, you have your verbs and doing puts and have your whatever index and get and show and all of that. If you're doing that, then the front end shouldn't be using those terms. The front end shouldn't be using the terms about the resources. The front end should be using terms about what the user is trying to do. What are the behaviors that the user wants? And then there's this intermediate layer that knows when the user is asking to do this behavior, I'm moving to do actions on these resources. And the resources don't even have to have the same names. And so you don't always have to look at them as actual duplication of knowledge. The URLs can be considered duplication of knowledge, but that's where you get into more of the REST type of thing, where when I you centralize the knowledge of the URLs for the actions on the server. And so the client doesn't actually know them. It knows where the entry point is. And then the entry point returns what are the URLs for the different actions. And so like when I do a post to create a specific resource, I will get back the show. I will get back the function to delete it. I will get back the URL. But there's also like that can add some complexity to the system.
So that's more like when the whole HOAS thing was going, like the hypermedia.
Yeah.
So that's what you're talking about?
Yeah, and that can be very handy when you're building a very large API that's intended to be reused by a bunch of places. But I would argue it can be overkill if you're owning both the front and the back end.
Makes sense. You also already mentioned that one of the talks that you started giving was understanding lambdas, not understanding, like playing with lambdas. And you're now, if I understand correctly, you're now writing a book on that. Is that a continuation of the talk, or what's the book about?
So the talk, there were a couple talks I gave. One was just like building up numbers. One was building lists, what you can do in 45 minutes. And the book is taking all of that and sort of putting it together. And the conceit of the book is, if we sat down with a computer one day and I was like, oh, you want to see something cool? And we sat down and I coded this and like talked my way through it with you. We start with just a lambda, the identity. And then at the end of the book, we have a mystery word game where you have the letters of the word and you have to guess the letters in a word within a certain number of tries. And so it builds up all of the fundamental data structures. We do it test first, which means I have to build a testing tool.
Okay.
So I have to build a cert because I don't have anything but a lambda.
Got it.
And so I have to build a cert. That then leads to building ifs and booleans. And then we test drive our way to building what ends up being a functional stack-based language that is all built on this underpinnings of just lambdas, going through numbers and all that.
If I understand it correctly, sorry, you're still writing it, right? So do you think, because what you're describing seems a lot of pages, do you think it's going to be a big one, bigger than the previous one, or not really?
It'll be the previous one. It's probably going to be between 150 and 200 pages. Not huge. A lot of that being code listing, because it's a very code heavy book. So I talk about some stuff and then like, here's the code that we would write. And it's lots of code listing. It's intended to be a code along with the book, not go sit and read. The previous book is a design book. It's about ideas. This is about, like literally we could be sitting in a computer and I could be doing it with you. And
I was going to ask, what language is it written in? Does it matter?
So it doesn't matter as long as you have a language with a decent lambda syntax. The first draft of the book, which I'm finishing up now, is the underlying language is Ruby. But almost immediately you get out of Ruby and into just this other syntax. A syntax that's basically around, the only thing that is Ruby is how you execute a lambda. And so my plan is, once I'm done with this, I'm hoping to have it out in August, because I have everything done up to writing the mystery word game, but I have all of the stuff built in order to do that. So that's gonna be a matter of putting it all together. And I've actually built the mystery word game. I just have to go back and sort of write it with prose around it, and put it book form. And then what my plan is, if provided good feedback comes,
Mm-hmm.
and I've had some early people looking at it and saying that it's fun, I'm going to port it over to other languages.
Okay.
So I'm going to go in the next one. I'm going to make the backing language JavaScript, because now finally JavaScript has a good Lambda syntax. I guess now finally, I don't know how long they've had a good.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really do JavaScript, and haven't for a handful of years. So, but luckily I don't have to really. I just need lambdas.
Right.
I'm going to port it over to a bunch of different languages.
Yeah, that sounds also some more work, but I'm sure that can increase the reach of the book as well, in terms of getting more people involved. But one question that came to mind was, so we've talked a lot about like your experience with different languages from Microsoft, then Ruby, but I never got to ask what kind of stuff are you doing right now? So what kind of languages are you still doing Ruby, or have you gone to something else?
If I'm building like a simple web thing, it's pretty much Ruby,
Mm-hmm.
because it's so good and so much of a workhorse, and it does what I need. I do for the past 4 years now. My front end stuff has been exclusively in Elm,
Mm-hmm.
and so my last contract, which was last year, I was entirely Elm. And so I love Elm. It's just it reminds me a lot of the joy of early Ruby when I first started learning it. And it's just a fantastic language.
With the compiler yelling at you that Ruby doesn't have.
Yes, exactly. The nice thing is that, and this was something that, I'll do this briefly. Whereas the C# compiler would yell at you because you didn't have a function name,
Mm-hmm.
the Elm compiler is almost entirely about your types.
Right.
And so in Elm, the way that I build Elm is I start with my types. And I start with the type signatures. And then what I do is the compiler, the types oftentimes stand in for the early tests that I would write. And so the compiler, I'm building a function. I have my type signature already defined by what it needs, what the transformation needs to do. And while I'm building the function, the compiler is sitting there running as my testing tool. And so it's telling me what I'm doing wrong, so I can make these small changes and then get it working. And then any tests that come in are really about edge case functionality in the thing, and not just the basic thing. So it becomes my testing tool, which is a really nice.
Yeah, from talking to people, I don't do a lot of work in any language that has like such strong data type system. I learned to code in Haskell, but that was a long time ago. But that seems to be the case, that people forego some of those early tests in order, like, just because you have the compiler, and the level of trust that you have in the compiler is immense. But
Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying that when the first system I built, the first two systems I built in Elm, we didn't write any tests.
Mm-hmm.
And we just used the type system. And we encoded a lot of the business functionality into our type system. And this first system we built never really made it into production, but the second system we built was in production, running like massive, and on a pretty big scale, like a couple, millions of hits a month, or millions of views a month. And it was done in Elm, and they were little widgets that sat on other people's
Mm-hmm.
websites, and it ran for like a year and a half, and we had no runtime exceptions that were not because there was a disconnect between the JSON that was coming in and our understanding of the
Mm-hmm.
JSON. But the code itself never had an exception, which is part of the goal of Elm, is to not have
Yeah,
runtime exception. And so
that's
it's
that's pretty good.
you can get away with it.
That's pretty good, especially in the front end where I think there's more pushback to testing, even though there's a lot of testing frameworks now. But at least in my experience, the when I found something that's not tested is more likely to be front end code than back end. So it's
Yeah.
good to have some insurance there. I was also going to ask, now that you've gone to a functional strong data type language, do you see yourself working on that also in the back end? Is something that you have interest in those type of languages?
Um, Not really. Like, I love Ruby and I love Rails. And the thing about Rails in particular for me is that Rails knows what it is, and what it does really well. And it provides a lot of the um,
Mm.
affordances that make it so that you can write good stuff very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And you can be confident that certain things are going to work in certain areas, and the testing mindset and the system, and like testing Rails, like it's just part of Rails is
Yep.
testing, and so you know how to do a lot of that, and I tend to not like the back end tends to be the most boring part of the system for me, because it's about managing your data. There's um, less of like the edge case things that your users do.
Yeah.
It tends to be more on the
Yeah.
front end, and
If you can
so
have a website with no users, that's perfect. You never get errors.
exactly, and yeah, so and I'm not. I've a lot of what I these days I'm more interested in is like building business applications
Mm.
and building them to match what they need to do to meet the requirements to get value to the
Mm-hmm.
customer. And so I don't need as much of like, oh, I'm going to go learn Go or Rust. No problem if people like doing that, but past the initial like just learning the basics of the
Mm-hmm.
language, I tend to not be that like it doesn't make me really excited um,
Yeah.
to do it. Elm made me really excited, like learning, because it was new for me using a really robust type system and writing a really tight functional language that was new, and there was more power to it. But when I look at some of the other really really good languages, Go and Rust and um, some of those, there's not as much in it that super
Mm-hmm.
excites me. Like, I really liked learning Prolog. I really liked. I fooled around a little bit with Idris. There's these ones that have something that is maybe orthogonal to what I know,
Mm-hmm.
and that I find more interesting now,
Yeah.
for
Have you
myself.
tried APL for like a completely crazy,
Yeah,
crazy thing?
I had a friend for a while who did J, which was APL for normal keyboards, they say. And so doing an array-based language is really interesting. And so that's I'm not done,
Yeah, the syntax.
but
The syntax just throws me off. Anyway, Corey,
yeah.
we're kind of hitting our time. I don't know
Yep.
if you have anything else you wanna say before we go.
No, just Stay safe in the quarantine. Wear your mask.
Yeah. Well, Corey, it was awesome having you. I hope you had a good time. And
Yeah.
just thank you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. It was great talking to you.
Okay. Okay, everyone. So this was another Subvisual Live Talks. I hope you had fun. If you liked it, please subscribe to any of the channels down here, and we'll be back next week. See you.